God and Country, Biblical Exposition. I'm your Bible teacher, Pastor B.E.Winship, vlogging to you from an obscure location outside of New York City in the unimpressive facilities of Harbor Bible Church. You may notice I have a new microphone. I've been having problems with the lavalier microphones. These little microphones, they're good, but the sensor in these little microphones cannot compete with the sensor in a full-size professional microphone, but even still we're having problems with the sound. I hope to someday get the video and the sound right. This whole channel is a work in progress. But the biggest piece of news this week is the government avoiding another shutdown in the passing of a huge $1.3 trillion Omnibus Budget package. And rather than breaking down each budget item and voting on each department separately, legislators lumped it all together into one 2,200-page bill. So that to get your pork voted on, you had to vote on the pork of the other legislators. Now, the bill increases defense spending by $80 billion and domestic spending by $63 billion. And that pretty much overturns all of the budget cuts put into place back in 2013 in the sequester deal. Congress also voted for themselves a $12 million pay raise, and also the Senate voted for themselves another $48 million for their department. And even with the Republicans running the House and the Senate, in this bill was $500 million for Planned Parenthood. Now, this bill means that the government will have to borrow $700 billion this year to operate, adding to the already $20 trillion national debt. And the bill certainly is not draining the swamp in Washington. The analogy of draining the swamp is the idea of removing the water so that the swamp creatures cannot live. And what needs to be removed is all of the money that keeps the bureaucratic ruling class operating. So this bill actually made the swamp quite a bit larger. Now, you may have missed this news about the budget. This passed on March the 24th, because ne'er there was a cry from the left or the right, from the Republicans or the Democrats, in opposition to this bill. And that's the real story here, that our civic leaders and the public are entering into a new stage of fiscal attitude. It used to be that the conservatives used to fight for budget cuts, used to fight against government debt, against wasteful government programs, and even the left used to fight against military spending. But now few care. And this has to do with a number of factors. The government has run deficits for so long, and yet the sky has not fallen. And so politicians and economists no longer express concern. And the prevailing narrative is it doesn't matter, we only owe the money to ourselves. If a crisis comes, the Federal Reserve can always monetize the debt by printing more money. And these entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, they're all pay as we go. So at some future date, if we run into a crisis, then we can cut the programs in the future. And right now, it is not politically expedient to cut those programs because the public won't stand for it. The public believes that these government entitlements are owed to them. So the only solution is to let the programs go on as they are, and hopefully in some future date, the problem will be fixed. There's this old canard from the economist John Maynard Keynes. When asked what about the future, he replied, well, in the future we're all dead. So why care about the future? Ross Douthan, editorialist with the New York Times, recently wrote that his earlier insistence on deficit reductions was unnecessarily apocalyptic. Now, I quote him not as an expert, but he reflects the current prevailing attitude of indifference toward debt, especially on the part of the media. We even have a president who has built his whole business, his casino empires, on using debt. And President Trump has even suggested that we should get rid of the debt ceiling altogether. So in the passing of these tax cuts, there was no push to offset the tax cuts with government cuts to spending. In fact, with the passing of this Omnibus Budget bill, Americans are both getting tax cuts and increased government spending. And the president hopes that through these tax cuts, the economy will so grow that this will bring in more revenue and cover these increases to government spending. And the president actually tweeted that in signing the bill deal, it had to be done. He did not have a choice. It got $1.6 billion to start the wall on the southern border. The rest will be forthcoming. Most importantly, got $700 billion to rebuild our military. $716 next year, the most ever. Had to waste money on Democrat giveaways in order to take care of military pay increases and new equipment. Well, the point here is that there is no longer an ideology supporting government spending cuts, nor is there a will to support government spending cuts. Back in December, Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, said that in 2018, the goal of the Republicans would be to reduce spending on Medicare and other entitlements, which is the real source of America's debt bomb. Quote, we're going to have to get back next year at entitlement reform, which is how you tackle the debt and the deficit. And Ryan went on to say that he was talking with the president about this issue, but the inside scoop is that Mitch McConnell and other Republicans took Ryan aside and told him it's not going to happen. It's too risky. It's politically unpopular. I mean, after passing tax cuts for businesses, there's no way the public is going to stand for entitlement cuts. If the businesses get their tax cuts, then the middle class expects their entitlements. And so in this recent omnibus spending package, government entitlements are all increased. Everyone wants their piece of the pie. In a recent Pew poll, only 15% of Republicans support trimming Medicare, and only 10% support Social Security reform. With the Democrats, it's 5% and 3%. So there's no will to reform entitlements. Remember the Tea Party movement back in 2009? It was created out of a concern for Obama's $1 trillion a year deficit. But all that concern has completely disappeared. Here's a great quote from the 19th century French economist Claude Frédéric Bastiat. Government is the great fiction through which everyone endeavors to live at the expense of everyone else. That's a great quote. Also, here's a quote from Brian Riedel, economist with the Manhattan Institute. Surveys suggest that the American people do not want to have a conversation about Social Security and Medicare. We want to spend 1/3 of our adult lives in taxpayer-funded retirement. We also want to preserve spending on defense, welfare, infrastructure, and veterans at their current levels, all without stratospheric tax increases. Today's politicians do not want this conversation either. They came to Washington to play Santa Claus, not the Grinch. Neither party wants to sign up for a suicide mission, especially if the other party is not on board. Isn't this the story of the prodigal son back in Luke 15? In his sin, he squandered his estate on loose living. What can happen in the life of an individual can also happen in the life of a nation. Edward Gibbons, in his famous work on the decline and the fall of the Roman Empire, Reason number 2 for the fall: higher and higher taxes and the spending of public money on bread and circuses. What is happening in America is a sign of her eventual collapse. It takes place in all nations down through history due to national greed and profligacy. So let's look at some scriptures here. Here's where we're going to get some real insight on this whole issue. In the case of ancient Israel, the biblical warnings, Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 10, "Therefore I will give their wives to others, their fields to new owners, because from the least of them even to the greatest, everyone is greedy for gain. From the prophet even to the priest, everyone practices deceit." Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 12, "It will come about at that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men who are stagnant in spirit, who say in their heart, the Lord will not do good or evil. Moreover, their wealth will become plunder, and their houses desolate. Yes, they will build houses, but not inhabit them, and plant vineyards, but not drink their wine. Near is the great day of the Lord, near and coming very quickly." And so the message of the prophets was that Israel was to be judged for her idolatry, her false religion, her sexual immorality, and the greed was more or less a byproduct of her religious moral apostasy. If a nation is bankrupt morally, it will eventually become bankrupt financially. The one follows the other. No exception. So the prophets of God warned of this coming day of judgment upon Israel. So what about America? Should Christians and Christian leaders be warning of a coming financial crisis? Can we be so confident in these biblical principles that we can speak authoritatively about a coming financial crisis? Well, it's not that difficult to predict even from a human perspective, because demographics show that America is going to experience a financial crisis. And that's the main takeaway here. Over the next 30 years, America will be running an $82 trillion deficit. Now, to keep that in perspective, the federal budget in 1 year is about $4 trillion. The coming deficit is going to be $82 trillion. And the reason is the retirement of 74 million baby boomers who all want their Social Security and their Medicare and their free prescription drugs. Soon there will be just 2 working incomes for every retired person in America. And that would require taxes in the range of 70%. If you collected all the money from every millionaire in America, it wouldn't even touch the deficit. If you cut this defense spending in half, it would have little to no effect. The problem with the deficit is not government spending on the military or even on government operations. The problem is entitlement spending, Social Security and Medicare. And what is going to happen to America is the same thing that has happened in public employee unions, where their pensions are not being funded. You see, the unions vote. And so politicians have promised employee unions grand pensions, even though they know that in 20 years, there's no way the government is going to be able to finance those pensions. But that's 20 years in the future. And so let these public employee union people just be naive and let them think that someday they're going to be able to draw on these pensions. After all, the politicians who voted for these increases are not going to be in office. They're going to be retired. They're going to be out of the state. They're probably living in some fiscally responsible red state. Let this be someone else's problem. And who's going to blame them for being generous? Because all that matters these days is to be well-meaning, and the politicians can always blame the accountants for not giving them the right numbers. And besides, in the words of Cain, in the end, we all die. So, Isaiah chapter 22, let us eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And this is why America is going to have a financial crisis. A lack of honesty, a lack of moral character in both her politicians and in the public. Remember the famous quote, democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the majority discovers it can vote itself largesse out of the public treasury. After that, the majority always votes for the candidate promising the most benefits. With the results, the democracy collapses because of the loose fiscal policies ensuing, always to be followed by a dictatorship, then a monarchy. So we can blame greed. But in addition to greed, we can also blame abortion, the killing of 50 million young Americans. We can also blame feminism for discouraging women from being mothers and having children. Back in the 1900s, the average woman had 4 children. Today, it's 1.8, below the replacement level. And in other countries, it's worse. I think in Italy, it's 1.4. In Canada, it's 1.6. So the whole Western world is going to be experiencing a financial crisis because of the left's culture of death. These entitlement programs were never made to work in a childless country. So be assured that America will someday face a financial crisis, and the demographics prove it. You might say, well, maybe it can be averted, but this is something I've learned. One may get predictions wrong, but demographics always tell you the truth. Case in point, I remember being back in business school in the 1980s, and I remember very clearly one professor who said that in the next 20 years, America is going to have some major problems with illegal immigration from Mexico. And the reason was that the birth rate in Mexico in the 1960s was an astounding 7 children per woman. And in the 1980s, the majority of Mexicans were under 12 years of age. And so this professor assured us that there's nothing to stop these young people from coming over the border looking for work in America. And he was right. And he wasn't a prophet. It's just simply that the demographics don't lie about what the future is going to hold. But again, this story is not just the crisis itself. Just as much a part of the story is the ignoring of the crisis. The social, the psychological reasons why these warnings are being ignored. And it can be attributed to the blindness that comes with greed. Proverbs 11:6, the righteousness of the upright will deliver them, but the treacherous will be caught by their own greed. Also, intrinsic to ungodliness is a general indifference about the future. The unsaved, they're not concerned about their souls. They're not concerned about the future of their souls. And also, that carries out into an unconcern for the future of the nation, for the economy. And the nature of ungodliness is to live for today and to not think about tomorrow. And again, we see that in the life of the prodigal son. How did he think his loose living was going to end? Well, he didn't think. He just was living for the moment. Jeremiah 5:31. Jeremiah asked the people, "What will you do in the end thereof?" But the people didn't care about the future. And that's the nature of sin and rebellion. And so part of the Old Testament prophetic account of the message of coming judgment is also the story of how the people didn't heed the warnings. And the prophets spoke not only of the judgment, but also of the short-sightedness of the people. Isaiah 56, his watchmen are blind. Come, they say, let us get wine, let us drink heavily of strong drink, and tomorrow will be like today, only more so. But it won't be, because Judgment Day is coming. It reminds us also of Daniel chapter 5. Remember King Belteshazzar was having a party with thousands of his nobles. All the while, the Persians were digging under the wall, getting ready to attack the city. Also, Micah chapter 3. The people were saying, calamity will not come upon us. Therefore, on account of you, Zion will be plowed as a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of ruins. Now, while the true prophets were saying this, remember what the false prophets were saying. Jeremiah 23, they were saying, peace, peace, when there is no peace. And Ezekiel chapter 13, they were whitewashing the situation. If you notice that we're no longer hearing among mainstream evangelicals, among the preachers, that Judgment Day is coming. And I think we can understand that reluctance because often it's the crackpots who are on the street corner with the placard that says the end is near. And we don't want to encourage the preppers with their bomb shelters and their rations. And we want to be positive. We want to be able to say that the gospel can turn this all around. We don't want prophecies of judgment to become self-fulfilling prophecies. And there are a lot of Christian leaders today who are not really convinced that we can take these Old Testament principles and apply them to the New Testament. And we certainly don't want to be guilty of crying, wolf, wolf, when there is no wolf. But let's remember, in that Aesop fable, eventually the wolf showed up. And we do have some New Testament teaching that tells us people will always be in denial about reaping the consequences of their sin. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3. While they're saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains upon a woman with child, and they will not escape. And this is the pattern throughout history. Right before judgment comes, the people are always saying things are going to be just fine. I love this quote from the conservative economic philosopher Thomas Sowell. Looking back at the history of tragic times often reveals that many or most of the people of those times were often preoccupied with things that look trivial or even pathetic in view of the catastrophe looming over them. People generally have no idea of what's coming. Now, a common response is that maybe we can weather through this entitlement bomb that's about to go off like we weathered through the Great Depression in the 1930s. I mean, the government can cut Social Security payments or increase the age to 70, or the government, by printing money, can just inflate our way of the problem. I mean, we can still be giving people $2,000 a month in Social Security payments, but it will not be able to buy a whole lot because of inflation. So maybe we can weather the storm. Well, that might be true of a godly society. But with the ungodly culture that we have today, there's just going to be a lot of anger, and there's going to be a lot of frustration. There's going to be a lot of fighting for money. And it's going to look like Isaiah chapter 8, verse 21. When the people are hard-pressed and famished and hungry, they will be enraged, and they will curse their king. They'll blame the government and their God. And also Isaiah chapter 3, verse 5. The youth will storm against the elder, and the inferior against the honorable. And so this will be a perfect occasion for civil unrest in America, an occasion for globalists and socialists to try to change America. And then let's just throw something else into the mix here. The entire world is experimenting with something unseen in the history of the world. And that's fiat currency, where wealth is simply based upon faith in paper, and wealth is simply zeros and ones in some computer hard drive. And that can all disappear overnight. And then add to that mix all of the nations of the world armed and primed for war. So this may not be a popular opinion, but given what the Bible teaches, I believe I can say with 100% certainty that Judgment Day is coming, that tomorrow is not going to be like today. And it may be sooner than we think. This illusion that we have of peace and safety, this lack of alarm among leaders is really not an assurance. In fact, it should worry us all the more, because when they do say peace and safety, sudden destruction will come upon them. But let me just add this. I am not concerned about all this for my sake. I'm just concerned for the sake of others, because that text, 1 Thessalonians 5, goes on to comfort and assure God's people of another timeless principle, that that day is not going to overtake us like a thief. We are sons of light. God has not destined us to wrath, but to receive deliverance through the Lord Jesus Christ. And I hope you have come to know him, his peace, his security, assurance of eternal life through faith and repentance in Jesus Christ. Now, the closing segment. Things God hates and things God likes. I haven't been totally satisfied with that title. I think I might change it to Commentary on the Culture or Chronicling the Culture. Email me if you can come up with a better title. I do like Isaiah chapter 30, verse 8 in this regard. Now go, write it on a tablet before them, and inscribe it on a scroll, that it may serve in the time to come as a witness forever. And that's what God and Country is all about. Chronicling the culture to learn what God is teaching us through world events. So the first story that I have is right in line with today's program. Recently, there were 3 New York City cabbie drivers who committed suicide. Why? Because the New York City cabbie business has lost its monopoly to Uber. One of the cabbies who committed suicide was a medallion owner. And for years, the city has sold medallions which give a cabbie a right to drive in New York City. This keeps the number of cabbies to a reasonable level. Now, one time, these medallions were worth at least $1.3 million. Now you're lucky if you can get 1/10 of that value. And one of the cabbies who committed suicide was planning to eventually sell his medallion to finance his retirement. But he lost it all in his medallion investment, and so he committed suicide. Because this medallion has no intrinsic value. It is a value created by government restrictions. And this medallion situation is a prime example of fiat currency. When a country runs on fiat currency, overnight, the value can disappear, where people are no longer interested in those binary numbers that you have in your bank account. And this is the reason governments fear cryptocurrency, a competing form of payment, just like people moving from the cabbies over to Uber. So what will the masses do, having put their hope in man and having put their hope in money? Suicide? Well, the Bible tells us in Luke 21:26, men fainting from fear and the expectation of things which are coming upon the world. So put your hope in God, not medallions or dollars. The next story is of great interest to YouTubers. A young Persian woman walked into the YouTube headquarters, shot 3 people, and then unfortunately killed herself. Why? Well, she was complaining that YouTube, in changing their algorithms to favor mainstream sites, had kept her YouTubes from getting the views that she thought her YouTubes deserved, and that YouTube had demonetized her. Not demonized her, demonetized her, and they're kind of spelled the same. Now, recently, many conservative YouTubers have been complaining that YouTube has been throttling back their sites, demonetizing their videos. So was this shooting caused by conservatives complaining against YouTube? Well, this woman was not a conservative. She was a vegan. She had all sorts of strange conspiracy theories. And the reality was that she was not getting views because YouTube throttled back her site. The reality is that her YouTubes were terrible, and they were vacuous. And sadly, she thought she was being persecuted, but really this was about her own ego and her own insecurity. The Christian position is not that of moral relativism, that all speech and all videos should be permitted. Pornography, pedophilia, vile language, slander, just plain lousy videos ought to be limited. The Christian position is that godly standards need to be upheld and applied, and Satan's standards need to be prohibited. Now, the problem with this is that only a godly people, a Christian base, can fairly discern what's right. And it's going to be almost impossible for secularists to police their platform because they just see good and evil as relative. So the lesson here is about people trying to find their identity in YouTube fame. What are they going to do when they find that that's impossible? James chapter 4, verse 1. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust and do not have, so you commit murder. You are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. All because you're trying to find popularity and fame and identity in the things of this world rather than in God. A third news event. Remember the Nashville statement? I did a program about that last October. The Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood put out a 14-point statement defining the historic Christian position on gender and sexuality. This group is an unofficial arm of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethic and Religious Liberty Commission, Al Mohler, Russell Moore, and this document was signed by thousands of evangelical leaders. And of course, the left was outraged by Christians stating their moral position because the left thought that they had buried the Christian views on this years ago. But at that time, the mayor of Nashville, Megan Barry, tweeted that the Nashville statement is poorly named and does not represent the inclusive values of the city and the people of Nashville. So here she took it upon herself to declare that the city of Nashville does not hold to Christian morality on gender or sexual practices. Mayor Barry is also pro-choice, and she performed the first homosexual marriage in Nashville. 3 months after that tweet, in January of this year, Barry had to resign as the mayor of Nashville because she was having an affair with a police officer who was in charge of her security detail, and she paid him $10,000 in bogus overtime. Last year, unfortunately, her son died from a drug overdose. And this is a reminder that the way of the transgressor is hard. Proverbs 13:15. Or Isaiah 57:21. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. And the analogy I always like to use is that while the ungodly are shooting at Christians out their front door, their own enemies are going to be running in their back door. What you sow, you will reap. Those who live ungodly lives will reap all sorts of sorrows. Broken marriages, broken families, health problems, financial ruin. Psalm chapter 1, verse 6, for the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So rather than responding to our persecutors and our detractors with anger or rage, let's just show them pity, because their fall is soon to come. Proverbs 29:16, when the wicked increase, transgressions increase, but the righteous will see their fall. News item number 4. Clear backpacks. Shooter kills 17 students at Parkland High School in Florida, and the government solution is clear backpacks. I'm not kidding you. Of course, the students are complaining because they see how ridiculous this is. But the commentary here is what happens when a people abandon God. Their institutions have to become legalistic, oppressive prisons just to keep people safe from the evil that the system itself produces. And the irony is that public schools today have far more rules than even my Christian school had back in the 1980s. Proverbs 28:2. By the transgression of the land, many are its princes, many are its rulers, its police, its administration, its lawyers. You know, when I attended public school, all of the boys carried pocket knives to school. It was a tool, and nobody cared. In fact, I actually keep one of my boyhood pocket knives in my desk to open letters, and I wonder if that meets the 3-inch rule. And we used to carry this to school. All the boys did. Now an adult cannot even take one of these on a plane. You see, freedom is always only for religious people, for a godly people. And ungodly people always have to move toward more rules, more tyranny, not only because their ideology favors it, but it's the only way to control the chaos produced by the ungodliness. Eric Hoffer, when freedom destroys order, the yearning for order will destroy freedom. One last piece that I stumbled over in my old notes, I'd like to share this with you. New York Times obituary of Edward Kagan. He died a couple of years ago. He was the head legal director of American Atheists. He worked to overthrow prayer in schools in the 1960s. He challenged references to Almighty God in the Kentucky state legislature. He brought a lawsuit against crosses on highways and against the 17-foot steel cross found in the World Trade Center site. He founded atheist camps for children. He conducted de-baptism ceremonies. He conducted mock communion services called Swallow the Leader. But his son, Stephen, became a Christian and a pastor. And when asked about his son, Kagan said, "One wonders where they went wrong." So the lesson here is that God can step in and break the cycle of sin in yourself, in your family. God can pluck people out of the fire for his own glory. And do you want a verse on that? Ezekiel 18:14. Now behold, he has a son who has observed all of his father's sins which he committed, and observing does not do likewise. So you don't have to stay caught in the cycle of sin. As Peter preached at Pentecost, be saved from this perverse generation. Now next week I believe I'm doing an exposition on the book of Habakkuk, which has some timely applications for today. Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube. That's greatly appreciated. Until next week, may God richly bless you as you walk according to his word.